Yeah, I do like how Jay pitted up How to Train Your Dragon against frickin' Star Wars. Yeah, that what a fair matchup that is. Not that any of them
Little,
would be
little,
fair, I
To be
guess,
fair, you
but,
put anything against
little
Star
bit of
Wars,
juggernaut.
is it
I know.
a?
I think
Yeah.
yeah,
I think
Yeah.
I think I just put them up in the order that you had them in the text. To be fair,
which is fair, and we
believe that's what I
did
did.
admit
Man,
to
could
Jay.
you imagine if it was
Random, yeah.
Taxi Driver and
exactly.
Star Wars? I mean, that would be pretty cool, right? I mean, you know what I mean?
Yeah. At any rate, my first one here is Star Wars, and I don't know if there is another score across a series of films that have hit the zeitgeist more than this one. And I mean, where do you begin with this one? There are so many tracks that are instantly memorable when you think about the main opening titles that we get in all of these films. There's, of course, the Imperial March that we get in the sequel, and then even when you get to
Jabba's
Phantom
Palace.
Menace, yeah, there's that one. You get to Duel of the Fates is instantly memorable. Yeah, exactly.
I was just gonna say, say what you will about Phantom Menace, but if I were to rank all of the Star Wars films just based on their scores, I might say Phantom Menace is my second favorite.
Yeah,
I thought if Brendan was going to say favorite, I was going to leave.
No, I mean
So that was-
it's hard to say that when the one that did it first is still
yeah,
right
that was-
there. It's-
whew,
Yeah.
All right.
Well,
Hey.
the thing is, Empire did the Imperial March, so I feel like you have to go Empire.
And Han and Leia's
Y-
themes,
Han and
there,
Leia's themes,
and Yoda's
Yeah,
Yoda's.
you know, and
I guess there's just something about Duel of the Fates, that track
It's
specifically.
so good. It's
yeah,
it's brilliant.
it's a
It-
brilliant track.
the fact that they almost named Episode 9 that title. I mean,
Should have.
Yeah.
they
Would've
should
been a
have.
better
They
title.
really
They
should
probably
have.
should.
That would be a
Yeah.
sick
Would have been a better title.
That would be a
It would
Probably
be
would have
so
been a
good,
better.
yeah.
Yeah.
I've read that spec script. Would have been better than what we got.
I believe it. I believe it. And then I just think it's interesting that, what, 30 years after the originals come out, they decide that they want to do another trilogy. And, again, say what you will about those movies, but John Williams certainly comes to play. And I absolutely adore Rey's theme. I think it's just as memorable as anything that came before. And I just find it fascinating that all those years later, as John Williams was getting up there in age, I mean, when he did The Force Awakens, he was 82 years old, something to that effect. And he still is throwing out bangers in that franchise. And, and it just speaks to the legacy of it and the prowess of him as a composer. And it's interesting, we're here talking about all these different scores, and we're certainly going to mention other works of John Williams we already have. We could have an entire podcast talking about this, like the scores just from these movies. Like you could do a whole essay just on the brilliance of them. And the one that I haven't even had a chance to mention yet, which is my favorite, I think, is the Force theme. As simple as it is, but to me that is so defining of the franchise, and it's used so impeccably within the context of those films and the heart of it and what defines Luke and the choices that he makes throughout a lot of those movies, and even getting into the prequels and what we see with Anakin and how it's utilized there as well. And there's something about it melodically, and again, I can't articulate it, but there's something about those chords up against those visuals and what those films are as it relates to the Force and this spiritual essence that courses through the veins of those movies that I just find so moving. I mean, I have found myself at times, and I do want to reiterate that while I do love Star Wars, I think it's become very clear and obvious over the last 6 or 7 years that I love it for very different reasons than the larger fan base does. I don't necessarily love it for all of the nerdy lore that comes with it. I mean, all of that is certainly fine, but I'm not going to get all up in arms because, a certain filmmaker does something I don't like. I think there's a lot to like in all of these films in one way or another. But what I love about Star Wars really taps into, especially that original trilogy, taps into, again, that spiritual essence, overcoming something that seems impossible because it speaks to something that is so deeply human as it relates to relationships and people that we love and fighting for them. And that progression in the Force theme, I think, is borderline profound in how it taps into those ideas. And I get the feeling of all of that when I simply listen to that track.
Sure.
I think it carries a lot of weight. So, honestly, if you guys sat there and said, I'm voting for this over How to Train Your Dragon just because of the Force theme, I'm not going to get mad.
or just because it's Star Wars.
Yeah, exactly. So like, there's a lot to love about the franchise in terms of these scores and what John Williams brings to them. They are masterful. If I was voting on my 4, obviously I'm not based off these rules, but probably gets my vote of these 4, if I'm being perfectly honest. Okay, How to Train Your Dragon. I am a firm believer. I've said this before.
You better talk long about this because this is the only time you're going to get to talk about it.
Fair. Look, I expected that. How to Train Your Dragon. I am a firm believer, and this might just be tinfoil hat conspiracy. This might be myopic of me, but I wholly believe it. And I've said this 1,000 times. I'll continue to say it. You swap out the logos at the beginning of that movie and it says Pixar instead of whatever it says. I think people consider that trilogy to be among the best of the animated genre we've ever seen. Those films are elite with a capital E. They're fantastic.
Those films are great. Yeah,
they're fantastic.
They're really, really good.
Yeah, you can make an argument that How to Train Your Dragon 2 is the best animated sequel ever made. I will certainly die on that hill.
Amazing.
It's so good.
Yeah,
I do love 3.
good.
The first one's fantastic as well. To me, that's just simply one of the best, one of the most daring, one of the most nuanced trilogies. I don't care what form of cinema it is. One of the best trilogies I've seen.
I don't love the third one, but I have to still give it credit and a pass because it sticks the landing. And that's what a trilogy ender still at least needs to do.
Yeah. I really like it a lot, and especially agree with that notion. Now, that aside, we're separating the quality of the films from the scores. John Powell was born to make the music for those films. They are freaking incredible. I almost swore.
Such an outlier in his filmography. When you look at what he has worked on, it is so different.
It is. But man, do I love it. And, obviously, the 4 of us, I was listening to a lot of these scores. And once I listened to the music from your guys' brackets, I went and listened to, some of mine. And, the first one I went to was How to Train Your Dragon. And it didn't take long. I geeked out immediately. These scores are so incredible. I love the bombacity of them. I love the emotion of it. I just love the texture that John Powell brings to these. Forbidden Friendship, another one of those all-time tracks for me. I cannot listen to that and not get emotional. Test Drive, also fantastic. Yeah, absolutely incredible what he is able to do with the music in those films. So, animated movies have given us a plethora of great scores that we could certainly choose and pick from. And I love Joe Hisaishi as much as anyone else. What we got from Michael Giacchino, or really a lot of the Pixar scores, I think have been very, very good.
Thomas Newman,
very
didn't mention him yet.
Yeah. Inside Out is one of those all-time scores for me as well. But How to Train Your Dragon for me, and I think it similarly to Star Wars, it's how he progresses them, how he continues to evolve them over the course of all 3, to me is just special, absolutely special, and I love it. So How to Train Your Dragon will not make it to the second round. Star Wars will obviously, vote it out. But
I like how you're already picking that for us.
Look, I accepted it before we hit record. So it's perfectly understandable. I get it, but I absolutely want to champion that score because I think it deserves every bit of recognition amongst the and the quality of scores that we're talking about here tonight.
Yeah, for sure.
Then there's Taxi Driver, Bernard Herrmann, another one of those that, like Vertigo, it immerses you into the world that Scorsese creates there so impeccably. There's something about it that that feels like I'm walking through New York City at that time, where it's a little dirty, a little grimy, a little uncertain. And I love how the score is able to kind of evoke all those qualities throughout. And it's also one of those that for me, because that's it's a movie that doesn't necessarily evoke bombacity or these like memorable themes, but that one I feel like is kind of memorable. Like you might not be able to hum it per se, but you can hear it in your head. And I think
it's the tone, right?
Yeah, the tone.
It has a certain style and a certain genre, but there's something. It's hard to explain. Like you hear it, you think, okay, this just reminds me of the urban grime of New York City.
Yep.
It's the sense of place that it provides.
Absolutely, and I love the consistency of that throughout the film, and how he's able to invoke that specifically is great. And then there's Hans Zimmer with Interstellar, and we talked about how I feel about that movie on the whole, but Hans Zimmer's work in this film I think is absolutely exquisite, and so different from a lot of the scores that we had heard from him up until that point. It's organ driven, which is interesting in and of itself, and how it accompanies both the emotional crux of that film and the largeness of it, I think is incredible. And I think that to me is what I find so, like, I don't, like, I almost can't explain, like, there's almost like a spiritual sense to it for me, because with where that film goes from a spatial perspective, it's something that we'll never get to experience, obviously, but Christopher Nolan,
it's kind of heavenly,
it's
right?
heavenly, yeah.
Yeah, and now we're certainly not, like saying that it is this or it's promoting this. It's up for the listener to decide, but it's almost church-like. It kind of remind that the use of that organ is a huge component in making it feel that way.
I agree. Yeah, I agree. And given where we're going spatially, to kind of tap into those kind of hypnotizing qualities, those kind of heavenly qualities, I think is really great. And again, not just with the emotion of it, but I think about some of the dramatic urgency of that film. I mean, this is probably a little hot takey. I don't know. But that the scene in that film when McConaughey has to kind of contain this spin, that is honestly I think that might be a top 3 scene for me in Nolan's filmography. I love it that much. And a lot of
what's so frustrating about the movie overall, right?
Yeah. And I think, and a lot of it is Hans Zimmer's work there. I mean, the way he's able to carry the weight of it, it's Matthew McConaughey's performance, even Tar's in it. There's weirdly a little bit of humor in it as well. And just Nolan's control of it tonally, I think is just masterful.
What happens if he docks him?
Impeccable.
What happens if he docks him perfectly? Nothing good.
Yeah, it's great. I love that. So like you feel the weight of it, you feel the urgency, yet there's somehow that humor also works. McConaughey's great. The visuals are just masterful. So, like I think about that all the time. And that track, No Time for Caution, I believe is the name of it, is absolutely mesmerizing. So I love that score. A lot of people also, I think Cornfield Chase, I believe, is the name of it. I was trying to think of the name of it. That's another popular one that has hit the zeitgeist from that film. Like you get on TikTok or Instagram Reels and start scrolling, you won't get very far before someone has utilized that track. Because again, I think it speaks to this innate emotion in us and how people like to utilize it for whatever they're trying to articulate in their videos. It just speaks to us on such a fundamental level, and I think that's why I love that score as much as I do. So I kind of rambled on there, but man, I love all four of these.